When you have been lied about for a series of years, imagine that for over a period of months and years, and you know that it isn't true. Did you make Kate cry?
No, the reverse happened. Kate was called Waity Katie, waiting to marry William.
Oprah Winfrey says she feels partly responsible for what she calls the nation she did on her TV show. And one of her biggest regrets.
Black screen, a heartbeat, a red tally light snaps on. Then one sentence detonates across living rooms and newsrooms alike. I'm sorry, Catherine. No teaser, no preamble. Just the queen of talk staring down the barrel of a live camera and doing the one thing no one expected on primetime television, owning the aftermath of an interview that rewired the world's view of a royal family. The studio air thins. An audience inhales at once. Somewhere between the lights, the makeup, and the hush, the plates of power start to shift. Because when a media icon reverses course in real time, this isn't celebrity gossip, it's crisis management at the level of a national symbol. In that earlier sit-down stories of hurt suspicion and family fracture surged beyond the velvet ropes and into the bloodstream of public opinion. Lines were drawn, camps formed, hashtags did the work of tribunals. And yet, as months turned into years, something colder settled in doubt. Not just about who said what, but about the way a conversation became a verdict, how tears were weaponized into headlines, and how a private argument over tiny dresses could be inflated into a parable about villainy. Tonight, the camera does not blink. She does not flinch. I never set out to divide, she says, voice steady, but softened by regret. I should have pressed harder. I should have asked more. It is a small sentence, but in the language of institutions, it translates to something enormous, an admission that amplification can be as dangerous as allegation. A single apology becomes a crowbar, prying open a door that seemed welded shut. Behind it stands a woman. Millions have watched carry on with unshowy resolve, smiling on balconies, bowing to duty, keeping silence as others spoke for her. The apology points at her not to an injury, but to a ledger of service, early childhood work, mental health advocacy, the long, quiet slog of public life, where nothing explodes and everything matters. The atmosphere crackles. You can almost feel feeds erupting outside the studio. Hot takes arcing across timelines, clips ripped and reposted, the same 10 seconds looped until it becomes a Rorschach test. Some will call this courage. Others will sneer at timing. But no one can deny the spectacle of accountability delivered without a lawyer at the elbow or a publicist squeezing a shoulder off screen. This is the sharp intake of breath before the argument restarts under new lighting. And here is the question that turns a TV moment into a political story. When a narrative that once dented a monarchy is publicly reframed by the very host who midwifed it, what happens to legitimacy? Does trust crawl back inch by inch to the palace gates? Does it leak away from those who benefited most from a single incendiary telling? Or does the public, exhausted by drama, reward the one figure who never joined the brawl? Listen closely to what is and is not being said. No list of culprits. No theater of blame. Instead, a contrast drawn in the softest possible ink, one woman who never answered rumors with counter-rumors, and one institution that, for all its archaic choreography, endures by outlasting storms without speech. The apology does not erase pain. It does something more dangerous. To tidy narratives, it complicates them. It invites you to reconsider the night when tears became headlines, and to ask whether the facts were ever allowed the room they deserved. Stay with me. In the next minutes, we will rewind the tape map, the pressure points, and follow the ripple from studio floor to palace corridor. We will test how a single sentence can shift the center of gravity in a story that refuses to die. And by the end, you'll have to choose, is this the beginning of repair, or just the quiet before the next detonation? To answer that, we rewind the tape, not just to a television event, but to the moment a conversation was mistaken for a verdict. In the spring of 2021, a primetime interview poured gasoline on every open question about the monarchy. A disputed bridesmaid dress exchange turned into a morality play. Private tears were recast as public evidence, and a vague account of a skin tone remark offered without dates or names on air was received as an indictment of an institution. The segment landed like a gavel. Timelines fractured into tribes. Threads, think pieces, and thumbnails did what courts never did. They canonized a single telling. In those first weeks, amplification beat verification. Producers chased heat. Platforms rewarded certainty. And the ugliest incentives of the attention economy crowned a winner narrative. Nuance, whether both women cried, whether apologies happened, whether a comment was a one-off or a pattern, could not compete with the velocity of hurt. The public, understandably moved by testimony, filled the gaps with assumption. Editors filled them with headlines. What started as a conversation about pain mutated into a template about villains and saints. Then came the long weather. Months slid into years. New material trickled in, not court rulings, not official findings, but memoir passages, counter-briefings, and careful reporting that added grit to the glass. One account suggested both women were in tears. Another indicated attempts to make amends. A later clarification framed the skin tone issue as a single remark, not a campaign. None of this erased pain. It did something more uncomfortable. It complicated the picture. And complication is the natural enemy of virality. Somewhere in that drift, the audience changed. Outrage cooled into doubt. Doubt calcified into fatigue. You could see it in the comments, fewer exclamation marks, more questions. Did we confuse emotion with evidence? Did an interview designed to give voice to hurt also become a funnel that flattened context? Behind the scenes, you could sense the recalibration. The host who helmed that night began bit by bit to step back from the drama she had accidentally supercharged. In quiet conversations, she said she never set out to make a bombshell, that the goal was a conversation, not a conflagration. If gatekeeping failed, then accountability would have to succeed publicly. Meanwhile, the figure at the center of the storm refused to shout back. Catherine kept showing up to the unphotogenic parts of public life, early childhood roundtables, mental health advocacy school visits, where the only cameras belonged to parents. When personal health challenges hit, she surfaced rarely and carefully, never leveraging the moment for points, never returning fire. This wasn't passivity. It was discipline, a commitment to process over performance. In a world drunk on statements, she made a case with silence and service. That contrast between televised catharsis and untelevised continuity reshaped the stakes. The monarchy is not a party or a policy-making bureau. It is a symbol factory, a soft power engine that runs on continuity restraint and the perception of duty. If trust is its currency, then misframed narratives are inflation. The question for a media icon who helped mint that inflation was simple and brutal. What do you do when your microphone has made a storm bigger than the truth you intended to explore? You do the one thing the attention market never budgets for you. Slow down, and you admit the shortfall. Not as a legal determination, not as a counter-accusation, but as a televised act of repair and on-air acknowledgement. That amplification without sufficient context can bend public judgment out of shape, and you direct that repair where the damage landed most visibly, toward a woman who became a national Rorschach, not by choice, but by inertia. Which is how we arrive at a live studio with the air drawn tight at a lens that refuses to blink, and at the sentence that resets the room. Before we dissect the choreography of that apology, its cadence, its framing, its deliberate honoring of service, hold this timeline in mind: a bombshell that became a blueprint, a fatigue that became a question, and a question that drove a broadcaster back to the place where responsibility lives, on the record under the lights, with 4 words aimed like a compass. I'm sorry, Catherine. And once those 4 words land, I'm sorry, Catherine, the room resets and the anatomy of the moment reveals itself beat by beat. First comes the stillness. She lets the silence work, refusing to outrun the weight of what she has said. No montage, no cutaway, just a host sitting inside the consequence of her own microphone. It is not contrition as performance, it is tempo as signal. When a broadcaster slows down, she is telling you this part matters more than ratings. Then the frame widens. I did not intend division, she says, and you can hear the hinge creak between intent and impact. That hinge is where trust lives. She names the gap, how a conversation became a conflagration, and admits the editorial shortfall verification lost to velocity. It is a small confession in ordinary life. On live television, it is a structural admission that the medium can amplify wounds faster than it can hold facts. The audience does not clap, they lean. Now the pivot away from the drama and toward the person who carried its cost in public. She does not catalog rumors or assign villains. Instead, she honors service, early childhood work, mental health advocacy, the unglamorous repetition of hospital visits, school roundtables, and community projects that never trend. She describes a woman who chose continuity over combat privacy, over public sparring, process over performance. By praising duty, she redraws the map. This is no longer a morality play about tears. It is a civics lesson about how institutions maintain legitimacy by doing, not declaring. Only after respect has been laid down does she touch the disputed pressure points carefully, conditionally. As an editor revisiting a page she turned too quickly. The bridesmaid argument is acknowledged not as a courtroom finding, but as a scene with more than one telling one, in which both women may have cried, and attempts at amends may have followed. The skin tone remark is reframed as a single comment, reported without the stabilizing coordinates of context or timeline. She does not relitigate, she reroutes. The message is not this never happened, but what you heard lacked the scaffolding that could have contained it. Then comes the institutional zoom. She remembers the monarchy not as a perfect machine, but as a centuries-old symbol factory that trades in duty and restraint. She points briefly to the portfolio of service around the throne, environmental campaigns, homelessness initiatives, the relentless grind of patronage, and lets the subtext do its work. An institution can fracture under the weight of a single story if storytellers forget what endures when headlines decay. The apology, in other words, is not just to a person, it is to the idea of continuity. All the while, the production resists the itch to decorate. No graphic packages, no accusatory lower thirds. Just lowercase accountability, a camera locked, a cadence measured, a vocabulary scrubbed free of spectacle. It feels almost radical in a medium addicted to escalation. And because it is simple, it travels. Clips jump borders, feeds repopulate. The 10 seconds play again and again, but so do the 10 seconds after, where respect is named and context is invited back into the room. If you are watching for tactics you can map them on: a napkin, admit intent, acknowledge impact, honor service, restore context, elevate institution. 5 moves. Each one lowers heat and raises stakes. Each one asks the audience to trade adrenaline for judgment. And each one quietly shifts the story's center of gravity from who hurt whom toward how do we live together after the hurt. There is a final, deliberate restraint. She never speaks the other woman's name in reproach. She never builds a ladder for the internet to climb into warfare. She does not demand forgiveness. She offers repair. In political storytelling, that restraint is not weakness. It is a strategy refuse to feed the algorithm that thrives on certainty and instead nourish the part of the public that can hold complexity without combusting. Outside the studio, the weather changes. Comment sections harden into camps, yes, but the temperature drops a few degrees. Doubt about the old narrative is permitted without demanding humiliation. Sympathy for silent service becomes sayable again. You can feel the ground steady beneath a figure who never tried to claim it with words. And that is the covert power of the apology. It redistributes moral gravity. Next, we follow that gravity into the feedback loop beyond the lights, the timelines, the polls, the editorial recalibrations, and watch how a single on-air act of repair can reroute a reputational storm. Because the story does not end at the studio door, it begins to gather consequence there. Beyond the lights, the feedback loop spins up fast. Clips leap from the control room to 1,000 timelines in the same 10 seconds. I'm sorry, Catherine become a litmus test more than a slogan. Comment threads polarize on cue, but something is different this time. The heat is lower, the oxygen thinner. People who once spoke in absolutes begin to try out softer verbs, seem sounds might. The apology doesn't erase anybody's pain. It simply changes the way people feel permitted to talk about it. Newsrooms pivot with whiplash grace. Morning rundowns trade the word bombshell for reckoning. Producers who built segments around outrage recut packages to include context they previously trimmed for time. Op-eds sprout overnight with a shared thesis amplification without scaffolding corrodes trust, and trust is the only currency a symbol can spend. In editorial meetings, someone puts 2 columns on a whiteboard, verification and velocity, and for once verification isn't the punchline. You can almost hear the algorithm grumble. Out where the audience lives, the weather cools by degrees. A poll here, a focus group there, all noisy and imperfect, but the directional arrow is legible. Sympathy migrates towards steady service. Suspicion shadows spectacle. The comments that get the most traction aren't the clever barbs, but the mundane acknowledgments she kept working. We didn't know everything then. Narrative fatigue has done something critics could not. It has made nuance marketable. Not everyone recalibrates. Some creators double down, feeding their channels with old clips and fresh certainty. But the timing misfires. Lifestyle posts meant to reset a brand land next to a live apology that models accountability, and the juxtaposition reads as tone-deaf, even among friendly audiences. That's the boomerang of the attention economy. If you try to pivot, while the room is still processing contrition, the room will process you instead. Meanwhile, the institution at the story's core quietly benefits from inaction. The monarchy cannot litigate feelings on a talk show. It can only accumulate hours of duty until the ledger looks like legitimacy again. And so the images that circulate after the apology are almost defiantly unviral: a school visit, a roundtable on childhood development, a brief appearance on a windswept balcony. The message is subliminal, but effective continuity is a kind of argument. Influencers test drive a new vocabulary repair context, window on-air accountability. Podcasts that once mined the saga for heat now harvest it for lessons: how gatekeepers fail, how narratives harden, how to talk about pain without turning people into props. Even critics of the palace find room to say 2 things at once: that institutions can wound, and that stories about those wounds deserve more precision than a primetime rush can give. Complexity. The old ratings poison starts to look like a civic virtue. Behind the discourse, there is a subtler shift permission. The apology gives permission to step away from punitive certainty without surrendering compassion. It gives permission to admire public restraint without denying private hurt. It gives permission, most dangerously, for those who monetized outrage to move on. When the market for fury softens silence and service stop looking like weakness and start reading as strategy. Do not confuse this with closure. Reputations do not heal on broadcast schedules, but the storm's geometry changes. Instead of a funnel cloud spinning around a single tidy narrative, you get layered weather systems that require patience to navigate. In that atmosphere, the figure who never fought for headlines gains altitude simply by refusing to descend. And so the gravity we traced out of the studio begins to settle in 3 places at once, with a broadcaster who traded spectacle for repair, with an institution that remembers how to outlast a news cycle, and with a woman whose proof of work is the work itself. From here, the path forks. One route leads to private reconciliation, another to hardened camps and permanent low-grade warfare, a third to a full rebuild of the public story around duty and modern compassion. In the final chapter, we'll test those scenarios, measure their risks, and ask what each would mean for the monarchy's most fragile asset, trust. So let's test those forks. Scenario 1, reconciliation in private. It begins not with a photo, but with a calendar invite, quiet off-grid, no aides with iPhones. The mechanics are simple. The people who can move the needle share a room, and they do the least televisual thing imaginable: they listen. No camera can monetize it. No caption can summarize it. The exchange is transactional only in the best sense: mutual acknowledgments about how narratives harden too fast. A pledge to stop adding accelerant. A handshake around the rule that the next chapters will be written with fewer microphones. The public won't see it, but they'll feel it in the temperature: fewer barbed quotes, fewer weaponized anecdotes, more photographs where proximity doesn't look staged. Trust doesn't surge, it seeps. The risk: one side will be accused of capitulation, the other of face-saving. The reward: the institution's most critical asset, continuity, stabilizes without humiliations that breed new wars. Scenario 2, hardened camps and permanent low-grade warfare. Picture a trench system mapped across platforms, newsletters, podcasts, late night snippets, influencer monologues, each feeding a base that wants certainty, not repair. The economics are seductive outrage, pays on time. In this world, every diary entry becomes discovery, every old clip a fresh exhibit. The apology is reframed as tactic, not turning point, and context is mocked as code for retreat. What does trust do here? It atomizes. The monarchy's legitimacy doesn't collapse. It erodes by inches as each news cycle invites the same referendum with slightly louder music. The short-term winners are creators who can weaponize fatigue into clicks. The long-term losers are everyone else because a symbol that exists to unify becomes a vending machine for factions. Watch for signals, barnacled talking points, strategic leaks, lifestyle rebrands, landing on top of moral storms. If those dominate, you're in scenario 2. Scenario 3, a rebuild of the public story around duty and modern compassion. This path is not glamorous, it is granular. It treats the apology as kinetic energy, spent not on victory laps, but on programs that change real lives. Early childhood initiatives get measurable timelines. Mental health campaigns pair testimonials with budgets. The choreography updates without breaking tradition, fewer balcony tableaus, more working visits where outcomes can be counted. The comms strategy borrows from the apology's restraint, fewer adjectives, more receipts. And at the center stands a figure who has always been most persuasive in the quiet register, now framed not as a bystander to storms, but as an architect of stability. The risk, earnestness, is slow television, and slow television bleeds viewers in a world built on refresh. The reward, gravity. Legitimacy becomes less a debate and more a felt experience. Families touch schools, improved stigma, lowered. That is how symbols survive centuries, by making themselves useful between commercials. Which fork is most likely? That depends on appetite for repair, for revenue, for history. The apology opened a door. Scenario 1 asks pride to walk through. Scenario 2 pays to slam it. Scenario 3 hangs a sign above it that says service and invites the public inside. None of these end the story. Each writes a different kind of sequel. And that's the unsatisfying grown-up truth of political storytelling. There is no final scene, only maintenance. So here's where we leave the studio and hand the story to you. If you value the slow work of legitimacy, measurable programs, fewer megaphones, more receipts, you'll recognize Scenario 3 when you see it. If you believe private grace can undo public damage, you'll root for Scenario 1 and forgive the lack of theater. If you are convinced that narrative wars are the only honest currency left, you'll brace for Scenario 2 and keep score like a sport. I can tell you which one restores trust fastest. It's the one that makes itself least interesting to algorithms and most useful to people. What happens next will be written in the smallest decisions: a declined interview, a draft speech shortened a visit, extended by 15 quiet minutes, where no one is angling for a pull. Quote, watch the verbs, not the volume. Watch who builds and who broadcasts. And then tell me in the comments below which ending you're choosing and why. If this kind of clear-eyed political storytelling helps you see the weather behind the headline, subscribe. The next turn might not be loud, but it will be decisive.